Yeah, I remember you mentioned it. Interesting. Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Toby Camps. I'm curator of modern and contemporary art at the Menil collection. Before we start, could I ask you to please turn your cell phones to the off position? It's my pleasure to welcome you to a conversation between Lynne Cooke and Francis Alÿs on the Fabiola project, which opens today at the Byzantine Fresco Chapel. In case, I think most of you have been to the Byzantine Fresco Chapel, but it is really one block in that direction, directly south or opposite of the Rothko Chapel. So we'll speak for maybe about an hour, including some questions, and then we'll head over there for the opening reception. This exhibition, which will be on view in Houston here for 2 years, is made possible through the generosity of the John R. Eckel Jr. Foundation, Leslie and Shannon Sasser, and the City of Houston. We're very grateful for their support. I want to introduce Francis Alÿs. Francis was born in Antwerp, Belgium. He studied architecture in Belgium and in Venice, Italy, and he began to work as an artist in 1990 after moving to Mexico City in 1986. Since then, he's created an astonishingly diverse and startlingly direct, beautiful, and powerful body of work that uses poetic and allegorical methods to address complex political and social realities. His projects have ranged from collaborations with Mexican sign painters to performances involving green paint dripped along the Israel-Palestine border, to a massive video and performance work entitled When Faith Moves Mountains that depicts 500 volunteers attempting to shift a giant sand dune on the outskirts of Lima, Peru during the last days of the Fujimori dictatorship. His work has been exhibited by and collected by museums around the world, such as the Art Institute of Chicago, the Carnegie Museum of Art, the Pompidou Center in Paris, the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, the Cadist Art Foundation, the Kunsthaus in Zurich, the Colección Jumex in Mexico City, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, the Guggenheim. I could keep on going. And he's participated in many important exhibitions around the world, including the Venice Biennale, the Carnegie International, the Sao Paulo Biennale, and he lives and works in Mexico City today. Lynne Cooke is a renowned curator, scholar, and writer. She is senior curator of special projects in modern art at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. Prior to her current position, she served as chief curator and deputy director of the Museo Nacional Centro de Arte Reina Sofía in Madrid from 2008 to 2012, and as curator at the Dia Art Foundation from 1991 to 2008. Lynne was co-curator of the Venice Biennale in 1986, the Carnegie International in 1991, and was artistic director of the Sydney Biennale, or Biennial, in 1996. She's lectured at the University College London, Syracuse University, Yale University, Columbia University, and the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College. She is currently working on an exhibition project of outsider artists in the United States in the 20th century, and you were just at the Orange Show this morning. And she lives and works in Washington, D.C. and New York. So, welcome to Houston, Francis, Lynne. I want to start with the obvious question, what is the Fabiola project?
My turn, all right. I thought you were going to shoot first. So the Fabiola project is I hesitate to use the word collection. It's like a gathering of copies of this woman's profile that I came across in 1992 on the flea market. I was myself interested in the process of copying. It was at the time when I started approaching, not collaborating yet, but approaching the sign painters in Mexico City. To make a long story short, as Toby mentioned, I was trained as an architect, so my skills as a visual artist and a painter in particular were relatively weak, if not inexistent. And as I had problems communicating my images and making, mastering, if you want, the art of giving an idea through an image, I thought I would ask the sign painters to do that for me. And that's really the beginning of the collaborative project with the sign painters. They really taught me how to make an image work. I mean, if you are wandering in the galleries here, it's very interesting to look at the Magritte paintings, because he too was doing, how do you call that, commercial illustrating art, and I do recognize a similar capacity of rendering, there was one with a candle, or a certain type of light, a certain type of texture of wood, in a very mechanical way. I mean, anyway, sign painters were the ones that taught me that, and because they were copying my images, I looked into the possibility of building up a small collection of copies of masterworks by what I thought was going to be Picasso's, Van Gogh's Potato Eaters, Angelus by Millet. And it turned out that on the same market I came across 2 copies of the same image, which I didn't know. I was out of my knowledge as a young learning artist at the time. I purchased them more out of the personal interest, like decorative purposes. And over the following months, I came across more copies of the same image. This happened originally in Belgium, but when I returned to Mexico, I started encountering more hand-painted copies of that same image in Mexico, and then it really started triggering some kind of deeper investigation and interest for that particular image. The collection, the recollection, if you want, of those images happened over roughly over 2 decades. So it was a very slow process, and if you look at the provenance of a lot of those paintings, I mean, there's probably a greater portion that comes from Northern Europe and Mexico, but it's mostly because these are the places where I live, and Belgium in particular is very, has a fantastic flea market. So should I be living in Australia or in any other Catholic country, I may have more of that particular country. That's an open question. The collection grew, as I said, out of my own kind of wanderings. It actually became a little bit part of my walking habits, if you want to go and look for copies. Yeah.
Could you describe the image?
Oh, the image. Well, you could hear. I mean, you saw it at the entry. So it's a very simple woman's profile with a red veil on a dark background, which can go from pure black to dark green to dark brown. There are many somewhat unresolved questions about why this image in particular has such a power of attraction for Sunday painters, because those copies were mostly made by what I identify as amateur Sunday painters. One of the most likely reasons is the apparent simplicity of the image to be reproduced, the kind of flesh, red and black combination. The particularity of the image, though, is that although it seems a very easy image to reproduce, the slightest deviation from the model instantly creates a different persona. So that's, for those of you who have seen the wall at the Byzantine Chapel or will see, I'm asking you to take the time to compare. Literally let your eyes wander along the wall, and little by little you'll become more and more aware, not so much of the repetition and the similarities, but of the differences from one image to another. And that's certainly part of my personal fascination with that image. The question I was trying to, in a sense, illustrate with this project was how is it that this particular painting that seems to have such an importance and a sort of what I call, arguably an iconic status for a Sunday or more amateur painters, how is it that it's relatively unknown, if not ignored, by the official art history? So this brought up the question a little bit of these two parallel scenes, contemporary, equally contemporary, having completely different references and sources of interest. I think Toby wanted to add something to that. You want to add something to that, to this kind of gap in between those two scenes?
Yeah, maybe we could infill this a little bit, because last night I talked about how this project is actually quite different than your other works. You don't see yourself, you see yourself as the instigator of it, and then you are the curator of this, Lynn. You've accompanied now pretty much every version of the Fabiola when it's had a public presence. And I think we have to circle back to this.
Maybe Lynn could do a more historical introduction to the Jean-Jacques Henner, who's the author, the original author of the painting, and the kind of context.
Sure. If all of this goes by too quickly, you'll find also a summary in the brochure.
Yeah.
But Fabiola was a woman living in 4th century Rome who had married, had an abusive husband, divorced, remarried, second husband died, converted to Christianity, and then, as a consequence, did penance for her sin of having divorced. And in doing this, she devoted her fortune to the establishment of a hospital and to doing good works for the sick and needy for the remainder of her life. And when she died, or around the time of her death, her life was written by Saint Jerome, and in the 5th century she was canonized. So she wasn't a martyr. She was someone who became a saint for doing good works. And then she sort of disappears from history and reappears in the middle of the 19th century during the Catholic revival, which sweeps through Northern Europe. And in Britain, one of the leading exponents is a man called Cardinal Wiseman, who writes a popular book of her life, a kind of Walter Scott racy version. And this becomes a bestseller and continues to be read by young Catholic women in schools as an inspirational text. And as she rose as a figure in the cultural imaginary, a visual portrait was made by this French academician, Jean-Jacques Henner. And it's the painting that brought him fame in turn, and he copied it, made other versions several times, but one in particular, the first, became the canonic image, and it's the image that all subsequent portraitists or portrayers of Fabiola have referred to, but it was lost in the early 20th century after being auctioned here as a very valuable work of art. And so what everybody is copying is a photographic reproduction, a black and white photographic reproduction. And that has caused or accounts for some of the variations. For example, the image might have been reversed in reproduction. So instead of facing left, she might turn up facing right, and that has misled a copyist, and you'll see a few where she's facing right, or she has a green veil rather than a red, because in the tonal scale in a black and white reproduction, red and green register very similarly. But generally speaking, it's all coming from this one image. And you'll notice, as Francis said, there is a huge variation, but there are certain standard features, like this rather full fringe, the way a particular fold of drapery comes as the cloak comes down the side of her face, where the bust is cropped, and so on. So these form the standard parameters within which each artist is working. Some appear more skilled than others. Some are technically challenged, and sometimes it's trying to negotiate the difficulty of rendering faithfully the reproduction that some of the most expressive and powerful of the images are made. And some, as Francis says, they're made by Sunday painters in large part, but there are also people with some skills who are making a number. And there's one, if you look in the lower right, there are two small ones that we hung together because they're manifestly by the same hand.
Yeah,
so you get a sense of range.
Were made for commercial purposes, devotional purposes.
Yes.
Do you want to say something about the reference of that Jean-Jacques Henner might have made in the Bellini and
to invent this portrait, since obviously he had no prototype. This was 10 centuries later. He adhered quite closely to representations of saints, but we think that what he's done is meld two references. He's looked at Venetian painting, and in particular the painting of Gentile Bellini, where you see paintings of the Madonna seen in profile, and something of the palette is clearly Venetian derived, these warm, rich reds. And he's also probably looked at Roman portraiture, portrait busts, but maybe more particularly at coins. And again, the idea of a Roman matriarch as a profiled figure with a certain kind of gravitas. So if you imagine putting those together, that would be the lineage, the iconographical lineage from which this image has been created. And there is, in fact, a painting in this group, isn't there? If you look closely, you'll find there's one picture of a woman that doesn't have a veil.
Yeah, and that's an original painting by Henner, which I actually found on an online auction in Austin, Texas, a funny place.
You call yourself the instigator of this project, and it started at a different time, the early 1990s, when you said there was a real disconnect between the art world and the real world. And if you could talk about that, and then maybe you could relate this to folk or popular practices too, and how these things maybe come together in some interesting ways in the Fabiola project.
No, I mean, this is like entering a more personal reading, if you want, that when I entered the art field, which is early 90s, I felt, at the difference of today, and I want to make that clear, that there was a quite big gap in between what you would call a general public, including my family, if you want, and the more kind of elitist contemporary art world. There was this kind of like mutual incomprehension, and to a certain point, what was perceived by the general public as a certain disdain, like neglect or lack of interest for their art to be understood by a wider public. So the Fabiola project was also an attempt to build bridges in between a more contemporary art scene. I mean, I'm hesitating to use the word contemporary because it's equally contemporary to the other art scene, and a more elite art scene and a more amateur, for the lack of a better word. You know, it's just another art scene that is equally active and having its own like references, sources of inspirations, and I do feel that this has improved a lot. I mean, maybe sometimes even in an excessive way, that the kind of role of art as entertainment has succeeded so well that now if you go to New York, you know, the Museum of Modern Art is part of the tour after the tower, what's it called, the Liberty statue, and you know, Nike is down on 56th Avenue. So it's just like part of the tour, and clearly some people just happened to be there because it was part of the package. but it's interesting. It's an interesting moment, and it has changed a lot over the last 2.5 decades in that sense. And let's see. I mean, this place is a very interesting mediation in between those two extremes. It's very open, yet at the same time it's very precise and very generous in terms of, I mean, it's sort of the anti-MoMA or the anti-Whitney in the sense that there are pauses in between different sections of the art world. There, you can walk in the grass, you can, take a breath before you pass from the surrealism to the Oceanian art.
Lynn, well, I mean, the artists who painted the Fabiolas are not the typical folk or visionary artists. That's, you imagine somebody working in isolation with a kind of interior vision that they must express. These are people who are trying to learn a classicizing style and have seen reproductions of the Fabiola somewhere, so they're aware of art history. But what does it mean to make a great wall of amateur copies? What does that mean in a museum, do you think?
I'm not sure that I would altogether agree with your definition of what a folk or a so-called outsider artist does. Even supposedly the most reclusive, like Henry Darger, were drawing on newspaper reproductions and children's drawings. They're very much part of a culture. It's often what they do with it that distinguishes them rather than this trope of absolute isolation, which is really more a cliche than an actuality, I think, as we study people who are on the margins of the mainstream art world. But that said, I take your point very much. This would be called marginal or vernacular or Sunday painters. I think one of the things that's interesting, and you've touched on it too, Francis, that as devotional images, these must in many cases have been gifts.
Mm-hmm.
And they're part of a gift economy, if you like to think of it that way. And I was thinking particularly about how many different embroidered ones there are, tapestries and embroideries, and beginning to speculate, given that she's the patron saint of nurses and of abused women. If we take nurses, for example, maybe they're graduation gifts for nurses, or they're for young women who've been christened Fabiola, maybe they're confirmation gifts. And since a lot of them come from embroidery kits or variations on that, one can imagine women of one generation, grandmothers and mothers, aunts, maybe making these as gifts for a daughter, a friend who's having a significant moment, either connected to what Fabiola represents as a saint or represents as a name and a kind of patron saint in that sense. And I was thinking too, maybe in terms of the paintings, there could be a parallel activity.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you partly refer to the fact that one of the other question marks that accompanies that image is the need for to have a Fabiola having its what you would call power or aura of protecting the home or the abused woman, etc. Is it needs to be painted or handmade. I mean, it can be needlepoint, it can be made with beans, it can be carved in wood, it can be, but it needs to be handmade. And it seems like unlike, for example, the reproductions of the Virgin of the Guadalupe, that are mechanical copies that can be hung in many homes, as you find in Mexico, and I'm sure in this part of the States as well. That image, in order to have its real devotional power, has to be handmade. And that's also a very particular aspect or characteristic of that collection is the need for them to go through that process, to that ritual, in order to acquire their aura. So there's a series of unanswered questions that accompany the collection, and in no ways do we want to close the debate or close the. It's more about bringing up questions and bringing up a kind of like.
One thing we haven't said that frames this is that there are no chapels devoted to Fabiola. Within the official Catholic Church, there is no sites where she is. She's not the patron saint of a church, nor even of a chapel. So it's really a vernacular tradition and not an official high art tradition. And therefore, for art historians too, she's been below the radar. But therefore, and commensurate with the fact that she has not had women with great money who've built churches to her or have been able to.
And like the Virgin of Guadalupe.
Yes.
Yeah.
The fact that the works are made by amateurs and people using craft techniques and traditions is very much part of that same status in the way that it circulates within a certain sector of the larger society.
Just back to that, just to really express, I think about visiting my grandmother, and she would have holy cards sometimes around, which I believe are like Catholic baseball cards that are blessed in the church. So they have a little bit of mojo because somebody has said a prayer over them. But then she had a painting on the back of a sheet of glass that said a German phrase, under God's protection, everything is put, basically. I think that the thought that an artist had poured their heart out in painting this and doing something to the best of their ability equals the blessing that an official priest might give. It sort of comes pre-blessed and it imbues the aura with this sacred aspect. Would you agree with that?
I think you can feel the sense of investment in the making, which gives them a particular charge. I mean, they're not quickly churned out, for sure. And the kind of, if not struggle, the incremental making of the image and the way it's done impart it with what you're calling the aura. I think that is an important part of it and why it might be valued by the recipient.
They take time to make devotion. It's a meditation. It's passing through your mind. You're thinking for however long it takes you to make the painting about Saint Fabiola and her story and deeds. So it's interesting. Although I must say, to me, I don't know why somebody would sign up for a religion that would make them repent for something that occurred when they were in a different religion. You think about the 1850s when Cardinal Weissman wrote the book as maybe a proto-modernist phase where women were getting more education and more social power. Was this a way, do you think that Fabiola was seized on as a way to, what does it say about women at that time?
I think the doctrine of the Catholic Church is pretty stable. I think women are coming into the nursing profession, and yes, in some sectors of society by the end of the 19th century, and Florence Nightingale's obviously a kind of signal example, women are leading more independent lives. How you reconcile that with faith, I think, is a complex story.
I agree.
Can I go back to your question of what putting all these amateur paintings on the wall, something about that, because I think it's a really great question. I think amongst the many things bringing this project here raises is, as in any museum of modern contemporary art, what are the borders, conscious or unconscious, between work we see as acceptable and work that is not acceptable, that it's not our mandate to show. And increasingly, it's not the look of the work, because so often now it's very hard to tell whether something's made by a trained person who's inspired by untrained, or it's made by someone untrained who's works kind of has an interesting correspondence because they're working contemporaneously and they're part of the larger culture. There's been a number of arguments put forward by people in the contemporary art world that since there's no visible difference, there seems no good reason for these classificatory distinctions, partly because they ghettoize the maker of self-taught work, and they tend to mean that that maker, the work made by the self-taught is read through a biographical lens. So I'm parodying a little, but the weirder the biography, the more interesting the maker. And of course that is totally false. And it also sets up a barrier to looking at the work and exploring it and seeing how it speaks within a context that's much wider. And I think putting these together here, where there are many other works made, we no longer know the makers. In medieval culture, makers wouldn't be foregrounded as people who self-identified as artists in the terms that we understand that. It helps widen and contextualize this question, both in relation to contemporary art, but also to histories of art.
Yeah, and maybe actually Toby, representing the Menil in this discussion, could tell us why, within the philosophy of the Menil's collection and exhibitions, he thought that that particular project was fitting, and eventually fitting in the particular case of the Byzantine Chapel.
Well, I think it's pretty clear that spirituality was a great interest of the founders. It's expressed in the Rothko Chapel down the street, which they founded, and in the Byzantine Fresco Chapel, which not only housed a series of frescoes from a church in Lyci, Cyprus, but was a consecrated Greek Orthodox church, and the land on which it sits was at one time deeded to the Greek Orthodox Church in Cyprus. So it was, it was a piece of a faraway place where these works had been looted and brought back and conserved and were shown for a period. So, we have this space which still, I think, resonates with its former life. And to put something there, we hope that people will come and look at these Fabiolas maybe as they were originally intended, as a kind of a classic votive image, which tend to accumulate and pile up and go very high in Catholic churches. So we hope that people will come back and use it in a way you would associate more with a church. They will come in and look and spend some time there. We're working hard on getting the proper seats to invite people to do that there. So we thought it was a kind of a natural for the Menil collection, and
And can you tell us a bit more about and that's of my own interest as well, the original philosophy of Dominique and John de Menil, what you use the spirituality and the spiritual kind of in relation to for example the Surrealist exhibition or any other artifact that has been integrated in the collection over the last 50 years.
Well, that's a long story, but and I don't know if there's one philosophy. They were Catholic and very interested in the idea of the sacred modern before the Second World War, which was trying to reconnect the Catholic Church to more leading edge artists, trying to connect it to modernism and revive the visual culture of the Catholic Church, which I think was getting quite stagnant then. And they had an advisor in Father Marie-Hélène Couturier, who was a Catholic priest, who was a leader in this thought. But they were interested in the civil rights movement here in the United States as an extension of their Catholic faith. There are many expressions of this, and you see it in the collection, the Byzantine Fresco Chapel, and a collection of Byzantine icons. It's
okay. Thank you. Do you want to pass to questions? I think we're...
I just wanted to, and I think people ask this too, but I want to hear some of the stories of where you found Fabiolas and what the range, where they come from. And is there a you know?
I mean, as I said, there was no method in the building of the collection. It was very much according to my own travels and in general professional travels. So it really ranges from Latin America, which also has a strong Catholic tradition, but also to Eastern countries such as Poland, Estonia, Leningrad, St. Petersburg. Then, as of very recently, I found the one in the souk of Beirut, which apparently had been produced by some foundation near Beirut, and actually uses that particular image as a model for commercial purposes, for disabled students, pupils. So the map is growing as much by my own kind of like travels as by friends who send me a photograph of a Fabiola they saw in a cafe in Tel Aviv. I said Jerusalem last night, it's Tel Aviv. That brings in also a very important aspect of this project, is that for as much as it was instigated by myself, it really grew out of a much more collaborative effort, in the sense that because they have a low commercial value, when friends encountered one, saw one in a market or another, they would purchase it and give it to the collection. So it brings an interesting question of what is the property status of the collection. I mean, I would like to see it as a kind of a public domain project, if you want. First of all, because it's been produced by so many different authors, painters, but also because it is really the result of many people's kind of interest, and that status has been somewhat eluded over the last decade, more or less, because the project has been nearly constantly traveling. So it's a bit of an ambulante circus, or wonder circus. And I wish that it could continue like that. And that's a way of precisely eluding the final destination of that. What is becoming heavier and heavier.
The current count is 514, I believe, as of today. Yeah,
which, I mean, that's a technical detail, but the reason why most of the frames were taken away was precisely the storage problem. I mean, very often the frame is twice as big as the image and 3 times as thick. So it does help focusing on the image itself rather than on the more decorative aspect of it, and it does neutralize somewhat its provenance to focus on the feature of the image. But it was largely a practical decision at first. Didn't you want to add anything?
Do you have any?
No, let's see what people want to ask.
No. Any questions that we can answer? Alison?
Well, I was talking about how it is talking about it as an ambulatory project. A lot of times when people write about you, they describe you as a flaneur or a walker, and that traveling is very much a part of your identity. Would the Fabiola project ever become a self-portrait?
Gee, I hope not. I hope not. I mean, no, I think my habit of wandering certainly helped the finding many of those. I mean, especially when you arrive in a new, unknown territory, going to the local flea market is probably the best way of discovering what's behind the surface. It's like digging in someone's closet. Also, like my friend Cuauhtemoc told me, it was the black hole of what? Black hole of society, a black hole of memory.
Yeah. He's talking about Cuauhtemoc Modena, who won the Walter Hopps Award for curatorial achievement.
Was here, by the way.
It sat at this very desk about 3 years ago here. So he's the great curator based in Mexico City and London and.
But I am less. I know people have used the word flaneur. I don't know if I'm such a flaneur. I mean, a flaneur is somebody who, aimlessly wanders, and I tend to have a purpose to my works. I mean, I tend to, have some kind of tasks, no matter how absurd or inutile it may be. But there usually is some kind of aim to my wanderings. So the flaneur figure is a more romantic image that I'm interested in, but I don't fully identify with.
Francis, I'm curious. I saw the Fabiola show in London at the National Portrait Gallery,
nice.
And loved it there, and it's beautiful here as well. But the space obviously is very different. You read it very differently in the context of a National Portrait Gallery than you do in the context, of the chapel. So how do you feel about that change? And the more devotional comes out here. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about that?
I mean, it brings up several questions. I mean, first of all, because you bring up the National Portrait Gallery, the fact that the project was proposed by one of the curators there brought up an interesting discussion within the National Gallery itself, because by ethical rule, or I don't know how you would put it, the National Portrait Gallery only present portraits that are somewhat faithful to a model. Like if they present a portrait of Henry VI, it has to have some kind of resemblance with what Henry VI was looking like, which obviously in the case of Fabiola was impossible to. We are talking about an imaginary imaginary projection of what she may have looked like. But there's several aspects to your question. One of them is, and I was talking about that last night with the person there, is that and that's a very in terms of an installation, the encounter with the Fabulas in this case is a very frontal one. You enter and you have suddenly all in one go the totality of the collection. In the National Portrait Gallery, the fact that there were 2 rooms, there was a sort of mise en abîme of the collection that somewhat made it more infinite, like there was an infinite reproduction. So each situation is distinct, and we really try to have each time a different approach to the collection. I mean, in the case of, in another case, it was literally dispersed along a, 18th century house in Basel, which had kept all its original furniture and integrated a series of objects from that kind of era. And it was a bit of a hide-and-seek game of finding one or the other in the closet, in the bathroom, and sometimes the living room, sometimes etc. But it was much more of a promenade where you would meet one Fabiola after another, and not the whole family, if you want. The common characteristic in between all those places is, if anything, that we're trying to avoid a white cube envelope. So, in a sense, and that's why I was asking Toby why here, there has to be a reason why in this place. And there has been occasions where we declined the invitation because the space there was no reason to show them there. And so you can call it devotional, you can call it from a kind of socio-anthropological point of view, etc. But there was always some kind of reason why the Fabiola would be presented in such place rather than such place. I mean, maybe Lynn can add something to that. I don't know, in terms of why here, not there.
We've talked about, as curators do, how context frames the experience of a work, and not just the physical context, the architectural site and its characteristics, but the social context, meaning who the audience is, what the history of the building is, what the expectations of someone coming to that building, whether it's a building that's become a museum of the history of Basel, as in case this 18th century villa, that's its role now. We've put them in 2 different monasteries in 2 different countries, Mexico and Spain, functioning monasteries, which have very different traditions. The one in Spain is a monastery that dates back to the 9th century, has 12th and 13th century carvings, which are on the World Heritage Site. So it has many different visitors coming for other reasons. The monks go ahead with their daily prayers and their lives and don't interact with the visitors, but people are attending services and they then would come and see. As part of being there in this small village in northern Spain, they would then encounter this group of paintings of a saint that certainly didn't have a specific history with the monastery, but brought up many issues around devotion within the practice of monks who are separated from the world, and then in Spain it was yet another situation. So each frame is very charged, and that in turn shapes the reception of the work. And exploring that from a variety of perspectives in relation to social practice, the origins of the work in private devotion, not collective official devotion, and those things are differently inflected with each occasion, and so that's made it an extraordinary itinerary in a way over nearly 10 years of kind of really foregrounding that question of display and reception and framing, which is relevant to any work of art, but we tend not to notice that. We kind of see the work as transparently available rather than mediated by sets of questions and situations.
As the collection grows, and there's at 514 right now, do you guys curate from within the collection depending on the space, or do you always display all 5? Is it important for you to display all the pieces wherever it may be, so all 514, no matter the space?
No, not at all. I mean, as a matter of fact, not all of them are on show here. I think on the main wall there's 410 and another 60, 70 on in the showcases, the smaller medallions. But no, I think you need to have a certain air in between each images. Should the wall have been smaller, we may have shown lesser. But no, there's no need. In the same way as there's no. I mean, I'm trying not to fall in the trap of the obsessive collector who needs to have all of them. I mean, many times people tell me, I saw one there in someone's home, and I'm more than happy to just have a photograph taken in the painting in a domestic context in such or such location, and that's enough. That's enough to kind of enrich the project and the investigation. I don't need to own all of them. It's in no sense it's exclusive. You say
Exhaustive.
No sense. Sorry.
It's not exhaustive.
It's not exhaustive. Voilà. So.
Front row.
Question relating to that statement. Are you documenting, forming an archive of the ones you're not able to
I'm trying
acquire?
to. I mean, it's this project is a bit of a hobby, if you want. I mean, it's something that I wish I was an artist. It would make it clear. And I could just be some kind of like weirdo obsessed with that image. It would simplify the status of the collection. so I do try to treat it as a side activity that I do for the fun sake of the arts and passion and joy, if you want. I mean, it's a pleasure to find them, to show them. We did a publication some years ago, and we would really like to update it. That would be the place to integrate that kind of information, that kind of document of one in someone's home in Buenos Aires, or in a cafe in Tel Aviv, like I said. I keep track on everything. I should put some order at some stage.
You made a distinction between gathering and collecting, and you seem to prefer the term gathering, right? So to follow up on that, are there any other objects that you collect or gather?
Not really. I mean, not that I can think of. No.
A quick question. One is, I have two actually. One is, do you have a favorite? Do you have one that you always display?
I'm going to respond like if I had many children. I love them all.
And the other is?
No, I think the ones, my favorites are probably it's more to do with the circumstances I found them than the actual features, though I do confess that I'm way more interested in the further away they go from the original image, the more interesting they become. I mean, the more the artist has projected his own image of an idealized imaginary woman, or sometimes men. So some of them have very mannish presence, male presence. The more interesting they become. I mean, the more the appropriation process is present, the more the image becomes to have its own kind of like aura and presence, if you want. But you'll see. I mean, you'll see the ones. Some of them are really far away from the original model, and yeah, they're probably my favorites, you could say. Yeah.
And another question is a segue to what you just said. I'm curious, have you ever speculated about the authorship and how many men made these portraits, or do you think it was dominantly
There's quite a few
women?
I would say it's...
Or if they're signed, or Or?
It's difficult to tell because I would say no, less than half of them are signed, even fewer are dated. But within the range that have a signature, I would say, also very often it's only the initial of the first name that is put on. So it's not easy to identify if it's made by a man or a woman. And because I mentioned the date, there's also quite often a phenomena or technique of patina, like they age the paintings, they make them look older than they actually are. So the identification of the paintings is a difficult process, and I keep a record of where I found it, when I found it, how much I paid for it, and all that. But it would be very difficult to kind of go further because they are fundamentally anonymous painters. I mean, there's no literature about those people. There's actually very little literature out of what we've done about the painting itself, about the Henner painting itself, which, on top of it, was lost and added another layer of unknowns to its actual nature.
Have you ever been sent some that were so bad that you have discarded them?
Not at all. I love never. No. No, it does happen to me that somebody shows up with a Fabiola that is literally wet still and offers it to me. That has happened, and I didn't purchase it.
Let's get
so
one.
At what rate does the collection grow, and do you ever see it ending?
No, the rate, as I said, I mean, it went from a few in the early 90s to 500 something nowadays. More than an ending, I would want to at some point pass it over to somebody else. I mean, I could easily see that someone takes over the project and carries it on nobody's behalf but Fabiola. But there is certainly a question about what is the final destination of the collection. I mean, I was playing with the idea some years ago of just redistributing them in the flea markets where they came from, and but it's it's very difficult to. I mean, when I started the project for quite a while, I hesitated in even making the collection public, because what was a very natural phenomena, by exposing it, would inevitably be altered. It's like a Heisenberg theory. And you partly convinced me that it was worthwhile doing it.
In part, we had a conversation at one point before realizing the 2006 installation, where Francis was arguing that it should be anonymous, that there should not be an exhibition that had an artist's name attached to it. And I was very opposed to it, because I thought it would turn people's attention to trying to figure it out. And figuring out which artist was doing it and why it was hidden would become the first question. And that really was, in a sense, by the by. And then after more discussion, you came up with the word instigator, which has a nice suggestion of setting something in motion, and then it starts to roll of its own accord and pick up traction and maybe deviate as the hill or the slope or wherever it's going it changes course slightly, and I think you've spoken to that very
close
clearly.
enough. It's what happened in terms of how the collection is happening today. I mean, it's mostly because of other people's contributions. So in a sense, it did happen in that manner. Yeah.
We have a reception for everybody down the street at the Byzantine Fresco Chapel. So I think we could take one more question and then all head over there.
Maybe along those lines, Francis, I was just wondering, before the project became a system, is there something about living in Mexico and the foreignness of Mexico that may have led to the collecting practices and that particular image in the context of Mexico City? Looking back at it today.
I mean, it's likely that the devotion to the Virgin of the Guadalupe was somewhat present when I started looking at that image. As I mentioned, the first encounter happened in Belgium, not in Mexico, so it was only confirmed by further findings in Mexico. But the devotional aspect to images is very much part of the Mexican culture. And also, and that's certainly part of the reason why so many showed up in Mexico, there's an immense respect for anything painted. It's probably one of the places where any painting, no matter how bad or good or old, is expensive, way more than in Europe. So there's this kind of like veneration for anything that is handmade, and in particular painter. When I go in a taxi and I start chatting with the taxi driver, and he asks me what I'm doing, I'm saying I'm an artist, and he's saying, "Are you a painter?" It's like with this, and when I say, "Yeah, sure," it's like there's a deep sense of satisfaction that comes out. You don't get that in New York, if you're a waiter. You're just like a loser, not a loser.
Okay, on that note, let's go and see the Fabiolas.